The sky over Ashton, Texas burned with the last light of day, the sun dipping below the rolling plains, throwing long shadows across the empty streets. It was a quiet town, the kind where folks still waved when they passed each other, where doors weren't always locked, and where trouble didn't come often. But when it did, it never left quietly. Trouble had just rolled into town. The convoy of black SUVs and armored trucks came down Main Street like a funeral procession, slow and deliberate. The townspeople stopped what they were doing. Shopkeepers frozen at their counters, mechanics wiping grease from their hands, old-timers rocking on porches, gripping their armrests a little tighter. Everyone felt it, the kind of tension that didn't belong here. Sheriff Tom Grady watched from his squad car, parked near Rosie's diner, his hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes locked on the approaching convoy. His gut had been twisted in knots all week, ever since he'd heard the whispers. A cartel was moving in. Now they were here. The lead SUV pulled up outside Hank's hardware store and idled, the others parking in a loose formation behind it. The engines rumbled like predators growling before the kill. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Santos El Lobo Ortega. Grady had seen his type before, lean, sharp-eyed, dangerous. He wore a tailored black suit, open at the collar, a gold chain glinting against his tan skin. His boots were polished, his belt buckle shone, and his eyes were dead. El Lobo wasn't here to talk. He was here to take. Grady pushed open his door, stepping out onto the pavement as Ortega turned toward him with a slow smile, hands spread like he was greeting an old friend. "Sheriff," Ortega called, his voice smooth, almost friendly. "Beautiful town you have here." Grady kept his hands loose at his sides, his revolver resting in its holster. "What do you want?" Ortega chuckled. "Straight to business. I like that." He glanced around, taking in the silent town, the way everyone was watching, waiting. "I represent some interests," Ortega continued. "We're expanding operations. Ashton is in a very important location for us, and we need a base of operations, a place to conduct business without complications." Grady's jaw tightened. "We don't do business with criminals." Ortega's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "Sheriff, everything is business, and in business, there are only two kinds of people, those who adapt and those who disappear." A heavy silence settled between them. Behind Ortega, his men stepped out of their vehicles, heavily armed, tactical gear peeking from under their jackets. The townsfolk saw it too. The way these men moved, confident, controlled, ruthless. Grady felt the shift. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a declaration. Ortega leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Grady could hear. "You're a smart man. You know how these things go. You have one sheriff's department, a handful of deputies, and a town full of old men." He tilted his head. "What happens when we start knocking on doors? When we start taking what we want?" Grady's fists clenched, but he kept his expression calm. "You don't want to do that." Ortega grinned. "I think I do." And then, like a switch had flipped, the cartel took the town. The storefronts were forced to close. Businesses were told to pay a protection tax or face the consequences. The local bar became cartel territory, a hub for drug trafficking. And then, the first man died. Martin Reynolds, a 65-year-old rancher, was found hanging from a tree outside his home, his body battered, his hands bound. A message carved into his chest. "This is our town now." The people of Ashton learned quickly. They kept their heads down. They avoided eye contact. They watched their home turn into a cartel stronghold overnight. But the cartel had made one fatal mistake. They thought they were dealing with farmers and shopkeepers. They didn't realize this town was full of soldiers. The first meeting was held at Frank Callahan's ranch. Frank had been Special Forces in Vietnam. He was 74 years old, still built like a grizzly bear, with calloused hands and a gaze that could cut steel. He'd seen war, lived through it, and buried more men than he could count. And he wasn't about to let some cartel take his home. Sheriff Grady sat at the wooden table, surrounded by men who had once fought wars for their country. Jim Torres, ex-Green Beret, a man who had taken out drug lords in Colombia back in the 90s. Hank Davis, retired FBI SWAT, a man who had seen more cartel raids than he cared to remember. Mitch Conroy, a Marine sniper who had served 3 tours in Iraq, and others. Old men, but not weak men. Grady looked at them, his hands clenched into fists. We wait for the feds, we lose the town. We do nothing, people keep dying. Frank nodded, his voice rough. Then we do what we've always done. We fight. Jim Torres lit a cigar, eyes cold. They don't know what's coming. Hank checked the magazine on his old 1911 pistol, the same gun he had carried as a federal agent. We make this town a graveyard for them. Grady exhaled. We do this, there's no going back. Frank grinned. Son, I haven't been going back for years. They planned their first strike. They would hit the cartel where it hurt. They would send a message, and they would take their town back. That night, the first cartel enforcers went missing. One was found tied to a fence post, throat slit, a sign pinned to his chest. Wrong town. Another disappeared completely, his car found burning outside city limits. The cartel started asking questions. Then they sent a team to clean up the problem. They never made it back. The war for Ashton had begun, and the veterans, they weren't just fighting for their town, they were fighting for their home. The first cartel enforcers never made it back. The desert swallowed them whole, leaving behind only whispers of their last moments, the kind of whispers that traveled fast in places like Ashton. By dawn, their bodies were found outside of town, hanging upside down from a rusted windmill. Their throats had been slit, their weapons missing, and carved into the flesh of their chests, in deep, deliberate letters, were 2 words: wrong town. News spread like wildfire. The locals saw it first, then the cartel lieutenants, then finally, Santos El Lobo Ortega. He stood at the edge of the scene, cigar burning between his fingers, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. The sight of his men hanging like butchered livestock did something he hadn't expected. It made him feel hunted. He flicked the cigar away, exhaling smoke through his nose. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't some town full of scared shopkeepers. No, these men had been killed with precision, with intent. Someone was sending a message, and now he had to send one back. The cartel hits back. That night, the cartel retaliated. They rolled into Ashton just after midnight, 6 trucks deep, loaded with men armed to the teeth. They didn't sneak in this time. They didn't try to hide in the shadows. They came roaring into town, their presence announced with the snap of gunfire and the low growl of idling engines. They torched Rosie's diner, the flames licking the sky, thick black smoke curling above the rooftops. The front windows of the grocery store exploded under the force of baseball bats and rifle butts. And then they grabbed a man. Bobby Henderson, the town's only mechanic, was dragged into the street, his face bloodied, his lips split. He had nothing to do with the fight, nothing to do with the war brewing between the veterans and the cartel. But that didn't matter. They needed an example. Ortega stood over Bobby, his polished boots pressing into the man's ribs. His men lined up behind him, rifles aimed, waiting for his order. The townspeople watched from their windows, helpless, afraid. "This is what happens," Ortega called, his voice echoing through the empty streets, "when you challenge men like me." He pulled his pistol. Bobby squeezed his eyes shut. Then, from the rooftops, a single shot rang out. And the man standing next to Ortega dropped like a sack of bricks, a hole blown clean through his skull. For a second, the whole town went still. Then, hell erupted. Gunfire tore through the night, but it wasn't the cartel firing first. The veterans were waiting. They had planned for this. Jim Torres had been watching from the rooftops, his old M24 sniper rifle pressed against his shoulder. He chambered another round, aimed, and fired again. Another cartel soldier dropped. From the alleyways, from the abandoned buildings, the rest of the veterans moved like ghosts. Hank Davis opened up with a suppressed AR-15, picking off 2 more enforcers before they even knew where he was. Frank Callahan stepped out of the shadows, shotgun in hand, and put 2 slugs into the windshield of the lead truck, blowing out the glass, forcing the driver to veer off the road. The cartel, used to being the ones giving orders, were suddenly on the receiving end of a bloodbath. Ortega hit the ground, ducking behind a wrecked car, barking orders into his radio. His men scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere safe. This town wasn't theirs. It belonged to the men who had fought in worse places, against worse enemies, and who had survived. It didn't take long for them to realize they had walked into an ambush. They tried to retreat, to run back to their trucks, to flee into the night. But the veterans didn't let them. Jim Torres kept picking them off one by one from the rooftops, his rifle a reaper's scythe in the darkness. Hank and Sheriff Grady moved through the alleyways, their shots precise, methodical, each bullet placed with the kind of experience that only came from a lifetime of war. And Frank Callahan? The old man walked straight up to one of the wounded cartel soldiers, cocked his shotgun, and said, "Tell your boss to come himself next time." Then he pulled the trigger. By the time the sun rose, Ashton was quiet again. Ortega had barely escaped, dragging his remaining men back to their vehicles, speeding out of town with their dead left behind. The town was still standing. The veterans were still standing. And now it was war. Back at the cartel's stronghold, Ortega paced, his jaw tight, his anger radiating off him like heat. He had underestimated Ashton. He had underestimated those old men. And now he had to make an example. He turned to his second-in-command, eyes cold. "Bring me 50 men, fully armed, body armor, grenade launchers, everything." The man hesitated. 50? Jefe, that's a war zone. Ortega's eyes flashed. "It already is." The man nodded. It was time to finish this. For good. At Frank Callahan's ranch, the veterans gathered once more. Sheriff Grady laid out a town map, marking key choke points, sniper positions, ambush locations. "We just sent them a message," he said. "Now they're going to send one back." Hank lit a cigarette, blowing out smoke. "We're gonna need more bullets." Jim Torres locked and loaded his rifle. "And more graves." Frank Callahan cracked his knuckles, grinning. Let them come. They all knew what was coming. The final battle for Ashton. And the veterans, they were ready. The desert air was thick with the promise of blood. The men gathered in the old barn, their weathered faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light, hands tightening around weapons that hadn't seen action in years, but still fit like they had never left. There was no fear in their eyes, only the cold, calculated focus of men who had already accepted death once before and walked away from it. Sheriff Grady stood at the front, his hat pulled low, sweat glistening on his brow as he traced a rough map of Ashton into the dust-covered table. The town was their battlefield now. Every street, every alley, every damn building a piece of the fight. Hank Davis sat to his right, rolling a fresh magazine into his old 1911 pistol, the same one that had saved his life more times than he could count. Jim Torres leaned against the wall, an unlit cigar between his teeth, loading rounds into the sniper rifle he hadn't touched since his last deployment in the Middle East. Frank Callahan, the oldest among them, cracked his knuckles, looking down at the map like it was an old friend. "They'll hit us fast. They'll hit us hard." His voice was gravel, rough from years of shouting orders in the jungle, in the desert, in places the government pretended didn't exist. Sheriff Grady exhaled, shaking his head. "They'll come in waves. This time, they're not just sending enforcers. This is a goddamn army." He looked up at the men in the room, eyes hard. "Anyone who wants to walk away, now's the time." No one moved. Frank grinned. "Ain't got nowhere else to be." Jim Torres slid around into the chamber of his rifle and smirked. "Let's give 'em hell." They knew the cartel would come with everything they had. Ortega had been humiliated. His men had been butchered, his power in Ashton slipping through his fingers. Now, he had to send a message not just to the town, but to anyone who ever dared stand against him. This was no longer about business. This was about dominance. And the only way he could reclaim it was by wiping every last one of them off the map. Frank pushed the map away, cracking his knuckles. "Then let's get to work." The first sign of the approaching convoy came just before midnight. The deep hum of engines echoed across the desert, the faint glow of headlights bouncing off the hills. The cartel wasn't hiding anymore. They wanted Ashton to see them coming. They wanted fear to take root before the first bullet was fired. But Ashton wasn't afraid anymore. Jim Torres crouched on the rooftop of Rosie's diner, his sniper rifle braced against the edge, his eyes locked on the approaching vehicles. The convoy was bigger than before. Trucks, SUVs, an armored personnel carrier they must have stolen from a corrupt police force south of the border. And behind them, a bus. Jim's grip tightened around his rifle as he adjusted the scope. They had brought reinforcements, hired mercenaries. Ortega had emptied every pocket, called in every favor to end this fight tonight. A radio crackled beside him. Sheriff Grady's voice came through. "How many?" Jim exhaled. "More than last time, a lot more." A long pause, then Grady's voice came back, steady as ever. "Good." Jim didn't smile. He just took a slow, deep breath and lined up his first shot. The lead SUV was the first to go. The bullet tore through the windshield, hitting the driver clean between the eyes. The vehicle veered left, tires screeching, flipping onto its side and rolling into the ditch. The cartel convoy slammed on their brakes, confusion erupting before they could even react. Then came the explosion. Frank Callahan had rigged a fuel tanker to blow, and the moment the first vehicle passed it, he triggered the detonation. The fireball lit up the night sky, engulfing 2 more trucks, their occupants never even having time to scream. Panic rippled through the convoy. The cartel had walked straight into a kill zone. Jim fired again, taking out the gunner on top of the armored truck, sending his body tumbling to the ground. From the shadows, Hank and the others opened fire, unleashing everything they had. Bullets ripped through the night, the sound of gunfire bouncing off the buildings as the veterans moved like ghosts, hitting and fading, hitting and fading. The cartel tried to push forward, but the town was fighting back. Ortega's men scrambled for cover, but there was none. The streets belonged to the veterans now. Inside the armored truck, Ortega gritted his teeth, watching the chaos unfold. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had brought an army, expecting a slaughter, expecting these old men to fold and die like the relics they were. But they weren't running. They were killing his men with the kind of precision he had only seen from trained soldiers. He grabbed the radio. "Flank them! Burn this town to the ground!" His men moved to obey, splitting into 2 teams, trying to push into the town from the sides. But they didn't get far. More explosives detonated, sending bodies into the air. One of his lieutenants shouted into the radio, "They have the whole damn town wired." Ortega's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a fight, this was a trap, and he had walked straight into it. Sheriff Grady reloaded behind the sandbags near the post office, blood trickling down his arm from a graze he had taken earlier. He could feel the shift now. The cartel was losing. "We keep pushing," he shouted to Frank, who was crouched beside him. "We break them here. They don't come back." Frank nodded, a grin splitting his face as he fed more shells into his shotgun. "Damn right." He stepped into the street and opened fire, unloading round after round, forcing the cartel into full retreat. Jim Torres watched from his perch, his finger tightening on the trigger as he lined up Ortega in his scope. The bastard was still in the armored truck, barking orders, trying to get his men to hold their ground. Not tonight. Jim exhaled and pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the truck's side window, grazing Ortega's cheek, sending him ducking down. He wasn't dead, not yet. But now he was scared. The remaining cartel enforcers finally broke, the survivors climbing into whatever vehicles they could and speeding out of town, leaving behind their dead, their weapons, their fallen leader. Ortega was among them, bleeding, humiliated, fleeing like a rat. Frank Callahan watched them go, then spat into the dirt. "That's right, you sons of bitches," he muttered. "Run." Sheriff Grady holstered his revolver and looked at the town around him. The streets were littered with bodies, bullet casings, the smoldering remains of cartel vehicles. But Ashton was still standing, and the cartel, they would never set foot here again. As the sun rose over the desert, the men gathered at the VFW bar, pouring drinks, passing around cigars. They didn't speak much, they didn't have to. They had fought for their home, and they had won. Somewhere, deep in cartel territory, Ortega was licking his wounds, planning revenge. But it didn't matter, because if he ever came back, they'd be waiting. And this time, they wouldn't let him leave alive.